Khoi, welcome to Born Extinct, my journey into the acknowledgement of my ancestors and my authentic spiritual self. My name is Atakwa, and I was born extinct. Genocide psychology is very well known, but extinction creates extreme difficulty in telling one's story, especially when one's land is still occupied. Being extinct describes animals, plants, and human beings who were killed off, leaving no living representatives. It is difficult to challenge misconceptions and stereotypes when the average person is highly unlikely to interact with an indigenous person. Therefore, our cultures remain only imagined and represented as if we are traditional hunter-gatherers from the Stone Age. Despite being here throughout written history, information through the media have created false narratives about the existence of indigenous people. We merely exist in the minds of general society as living in the 21st century, and our struggle for recognition is impeded by invisibility, like mythological creatures. Stereotypes are a powerful tool against the Khoi and the Sun. We are perpetually stuck in the 1700s. Our culture is perpetually portrayed as being static and traditional, instead as ever-changing as it is in reality. We can never be your neighbor, doctor, colleague, or teacher, although there's acknowledgement that we are the keepers of ancient knowledge. All this is very inconvenient, while our indigenous product, like fynbos, rooibos, hoodia, buchu, is appropriated by the white settler who have made billions selling it in European markets. These very damaging stereotypes infuriates indigenous people and has real consequences in real life. The small population argument has been used when resources and services are required for indigenous people to justify and rationalize the invisibility and erasure of indigenous people. We are rarely in the media, the arts, or positions of power in government or the private sector. Equality is widely known but also widely ignored. Indigenous people who make it into professions other than servitude spend most of their careers feeling like imposters and dealing with self-worth. Indigenous people in South Africa are regularly victims of vitriol by the coloured community and white community, who enjoy making comments like Bushman, Hottentot, barbarian, thief, and others. Today, the negative image continues as Khoi and Sun are often referred to as dirty, irrational, given to sudden fits of anger, violent, hypocritical, dishonest, lazy, and stupid. Terra nullius, the foundation of this country, and its poison is glaringly obvious today, with the un-African borders, high walls, and land ownership. Indigenous people are arising with the same perseverance that sustained us through colonization and apartheid. We have moved past the illusion that the world outside Europe was huge and empty, just waiting to be inhabited by Europeans and their superior cultures. Despite this admission, we remain invisible. Portrayals of indigenous people as bloodthirsty savages are slowly disappearing. Where the harsh stereotypes of indigenous people were found, the stereotyping of indigenous people must be understood in the historical context, which includes conquest, forced displacement, and eradication of cultures. Negative stereotypes associated with prejudice and discrimination continues to impact indigenous people. Stereotypes such as mascots is an example of extreme prejudice by dominant culture, and racial stereotypes, as we've seen in the Cape during the Cape Coon Carnival. The continued use of mascots show that racism and disrespect from one group to another is still tolerated and is very harmful towards indigenous people. It reminds us of the limited ways in which others see us and also restricts the way we are allowed to see ourselves. This has a very negative impact on indigenous children. South African learners and students learn some of the most harmful misconceptions and biases towards Indigenous people. With no mention of ongoing conflict over land, water, and sovereignty, Indigenous people, it is easy for non-Khoi people to develop their own narratives about us. Our invisibility makes it easier to create an over-sexualized caricature of Indigenous women, everything from fashion to Halloween costumes. We must end this invisibility and erasure and false narratives for future generations. It also teaches Indigenous children that it's acceptable to engage in culturally abusive practices and perpetuate negative stereotypes of others. The negative stereotyping of Indigenous people creates an unwelcome, negative, and hostile learning environment for Indigenous learners at school and affirms negative images and stereotypes that are promoted in the mainstream media. White adults working with Indigenous children are more likely to do the most damage as they hold the most stereotypes. Racial beliefs of and attitudes of adults has meaningful influence as children become teenagers and adults. Teaching about history and culture of Indigenous people in white settler communities can serve as a balancer to the dominant European narrative, yet the inclusion of these stories are often met with white resistance. The politics of resentment by white parents are used to normalize schools as white spaces, while claiming multiculturalism in order to portray themselves as burdened by excessive generosity and inclusivity. Ethnic beliefs are predictive of conscious and unconscious behavior, including levels of helping, passive negligence, verbal and nonverbal behaviors, word choices, eye contact, facial expressions, and the degree of personal distancing and facial expressions. Children from racially stigmatized groups experience substantially more inequalities in health, with an equal burden on diseases continuing into adulthood. Over the centuries, Indigenous people have internalized these stereotypes to the point that they view themselves as inferior, often describes themselves as simple. Next time, I will talk about how we became invisible. Kaiga Gungs for your time. Cape of Storms, Cape of Good Hope, Falls Bay, Table Bay, Settler. It was not yours to take. I am Atakwa, and I was born extinct.